Good afternoon, all. My name is Carlos Marcos de Almeida, and I am the host of this session. I would like to start to welcome you all to the session on Edmund Burke and the idea of Christendom in association with the Burke Society of America and the Russell Kirk Center. Allow me some opening remarks on the philosophical character of Burke. Edmund Burke was a remarkable man because he was a remarkable thinker. One cannot confine his merit to his rhetoric and will sum up his accomplishments as literary while putting aside the substance of his thoughts as controversial. His words do not ring hollow. His flights of imaginations are not empty abstractions. His marvelous literary skills do not excuse us from taking him seriously, which requires taking his thoughts seriously as political philosophy. Although he never wrote a treatise of political philosophy, there is ample reason in this political philosophy itself for his having omitted to do so. Burke thought his treatise would have lost the essence of his thought, and his style was suited to its substance. To see deep into the roots of events and into the cause of the present discontent cannot but seem a sort of inflation as daily occurrences are put in trend and seen as effects. Burke attempts to invest the mundane with significance seems to make it lose its character as just mundane events. For these arguments, but not only for the sake of these arguments, Edmund Burke is never out of time. Edmund Burke is never out of place. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to hand over the session to our chairman and moderator, Professor Miguel Morgado. Please, the floor is yours, Miguel.
Thank you, Carlos. Let me welcome you again to our wonderful panel on Edmund Burke and the concept of Christendom. And I send my greetings to our speakers online, as well as to Professor Ivone Moreira. She's sitting here with us. They are great experts on the subject we are going to discuss in the next hour and a half. And let me start by following the order inscribed in our program. And I'll introduce Professor Ian Crowe first. I'll give him the floor afterwards. Professor Ian Crowe is a historian, and he's the director of the Edmund Burke Society of America and a senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. He's a great expert on Edmund Burke, and I'll give the floor now back to him. Professor Ian Crowe, can you listen to us? Are you receiving us loud and clear?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Go ahead, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the host and to the chair of the panel for your introduction. And I greatly appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel in the Estoril Political Forum. My paper is entitled Edmund Burke and the Dream of Cicero. The means by which the Western Allies achieved victory in 1945 profoundly affected their ability to implement their stated war aims. In the United States, expanding access to trade and the world's raw materials became entwined with the concern that sovereign rights of self-government were under threat from a triumphant Soviet communism. For the British, imperial decline in the face of worldwide movements for self-determination jeopardized ambitious plans for financing a model welfare revolution at home. Such complications did impact post-war conservatives on each side of the Atlantic, as we see in salient responses to the legacy of Edmund Burke. There was Burke, the anti-ideologue and champion of Western civilization in the States, and in Britain, a more muted, pragmatic version of the statesman, buried in the art of the possible. While the Fordham historian Paul Levack praised Burke's high intellectual virtue in the defense of Christendom, the influential Cambridge historian J.H. Plum dismissed his political philosophy as utter rubbish. The American Burke came fully adaptable to the threat posed to the principles of the Atlantic Charter by an atheistic ideology. The British model, stripped and equipped, was fitted for the more circumstantial consequences of the peace, so long, that is, as the R word, religion, was avoided. There was, though, one oddity in this post-war British landscape that is noteworthy. I think because, as the exception that proves the rule, it points to two roads not taken. One, a political path toward a more robust, conservative defence of the social and cultural role of religion in post-war liberal democracies. The other, an academic avenue offering a more informative view of Burke's own conception of Christendom as an arena for the exercise of statesmanship. The oddity itself is a slim volume entitled Edmund Burke, Christian Statesman, written by E. Reynolds and published in 1948 by the Student Christian Movement. There are 2 points of interest, I think, about this item. The first is its author. Reynolds, who was raised in the Quaker tradition, became an active proponent of the mission of the League of Nations and a parliamentary candidate for the Labour Party in the interwar years. During the Second World War, he was received into the Roman Catholic Church, and while few of his numerous publications pass beyond competent and sharp syntheses of secondary works, he became a significant figure in the field of research on Thomas More, being elected first president of the Amici Tomei Mori on its foundation in 1962 and editing its journal Moriana for some years. The second point of interest is Reynolds' defence of his biography's core theme. No other statesman of that time, Reynolds writes, so definitely took his stand on Christian ground, for Burke was reaffirming the traditional teaching of the Church. Unless we grasp this fundamental conception, we cannot understand Burke's thought, for it is the unifying element. In fact, Reynolds fails to elaborate explicitly upon that theme in the book itself, and his rallying cry went largely unheeded. But this may be as good a moment as any to take a stab at asking if there is, if there ever was, any real purchase in that term Christian statesman for Burke's studies and by association for conservatism as a critical intellectual movement in post-war liberal democracy. The concept of the statesman was, of course, pervasive in Burke's world, but it is not a term that appears with any frequency in Burke's own published writings. Such concepts were discussed and contested in the 18th century, largely through the representation of earlier historical figures and controversies. Ancient debates and political hostilities were fought again, mutatis mutandis, with the tools of positive imitation or negative imputation. Reed Browning covered such ground in his study of the ideology of the court Whigs, where 18th century concepts of patriotism and of patriot resistance were rehearsed through figures from Cato to Ahithophel, and increasingly through the appropriation of Tully, Cicero, in polemical pamphlets and scholarly editions of his works. Browning's study closes in the 1750s, but that is also a time when we can detect subtle shifts in the interpretation of Cicero's legacy. A figure originally weaponized against the patriot opposition to Walpole was now being embraced by a revised patriot program, aiming to reconfigure the movement of Lord Bolingbroke in line with new dynastic, political and imperial circumstances. This evolution can be traced in contemporary publication and republication of Cicero's works during the mid-century. Just at the time, actually, when a young Edmund Burke was honing his political and literary interests at Tully's Head, the book-selling business of the patriot author, poet and playwright Robert Dodsley in London. And of course, Cicero's influence upon Burke's career and self-identity has been broadly recognised in his oratory, his historical and aesthetic writings, his critiques of British imperial policy, his self-identification as a nous homo, even his innovative conception of party, and in his understanding of the integral relationship between the virtuous and the active life. Yet the potential significance to Burke's thought of Cicero's approach to religion has received relatively little attention over the years. Perhaps there is a clue to this relative neglect in an observation by the scholar Paul McKendrick, who commented en passant in a passage on the legacy of Cicero's philosophical works in the 18th century that, quote, Burke and Cicero are each representatives of that rare breed, the intelligent, reforming conservative. I shall focus in this brief examination on Cicero's De Natura Deorum, a text that may seem to support the drift of McKendrick's observation. Completed by Cicero in 45 BC, it comprises an imaginary discussion on the nature of the gods between an Epicurean, Velleius, a Stoic, Balbus, and Cotta, a member of the academic school, the one favoured also by the narrator, Cicero himself. Giving Velleius's specious arguments little of his time, Cotta launches a spirited refutation of the philosophical arguments of Balbus in Book 3, demolishing Stoic proofs of the existence of the gods and their providential interventions. After which we are told, Velleius, quote, judged that the arguments of Cotta were truest. But the work closes with an abrupt twist, as Cicero himself opines that Balbus's discourse, quote, seemed to me to have the greater probability. The assumption is easily made that Cicero here is concealing his own skepticism about central features of the Roman religion in full view, as it were, behind the figure of the urbane Cotta, who has, amid swings of his wrecking ball, been careful to express his adamant, quote, belief in the immortal gods inherited from our forefathers. Conyers Middleton, in his influential Life of Cicero, which appeared in 1744, commented on the strength of this text that, quote, there was not a man of liberal education who did not consider religion as an engine of state or political system, contrived for the uses of government and to keep the people in order, unquote. It is an assumption that might fit well with accepted notions of Burke's imitative Ciceronian statesmanship, grounded upon skepticism and prudence. But is there an alternative reading of the close of Cicero's text that we're overlooking in our willingness to affirm Burke's intelligent, reforming, conservative credentials? Cotta's attack on Balbus's reasoned kind of philosophical theology are vehemently conclusive as counter-argument, but they do not render religion insubstantial or false. In separating religion from the authority of philosophical systems, as he does, Cotta affirms the reality of the gods. Quote, you adduce all these arguments, he tells Balbus at one point, to prove that the gods exist, and by arguing, you render doubtful a matter which, in my opinion, admits of no doubt at all. Seen from this perspective, Cicero's final words in De Natura Deorum do not convey closet utilitarian truth about religion, but quite the opposite. They seem to advise that in the ultimate incompatibility of rational inquiry with religious belief, a well-ordered state must be defined by its capacity to absorb in its customs and institutions the tension that exists naturally between man's temporal and transcendent existence. The ability to absorb this paradoxical awareness in the performance of public service may be then considered essential to the statesman's craft, precisely because it embraces the realization that the state itself, to which one is devoting one's service, can never be the final arbiter of what is just or true. That Burke may have understood Cicero's religious statesmanship in this way is suggested by a short essay to be found in his notebook, entitled Religion of No Efficacy as a State Engine. Note the echo of Middleton's quotation above. Here, Burke argues that if, quote, we confine the ends of religion to this world, we naturally annihilate its operation, which must wholly depend on the consideration of another world. In a kind of logical inversion, the argument can also be read in Burke's Vindication of Natural Society, published in 1756, a merciless parody of a freethinker's carefully reasoned condemnation of civil society in the name of natural reason. Quote again, if we were to examine the divine fabrics by our ideas of reason and fitness, Burke writes in his preface to this piece, and to use the same method of attack by which some men have assaulted revealed religion, we might with as good colour and with the same success make the wisdom and power of God in his creation appear to many no better than foolishness. To conclude, Burke's conception of Christendom may be found as deeply in his own imitation or representation of Cicero as a religious statesman as in his rhetoric, his conception of empire, or his social self-identification. Now that might seem a rather insipid claim, except that Cicero's thought has too readily been co-opted into a modern conception of secularized liberal democracy, in line with the deeper currents of conservative thought in Britain and the accompanying polarization of views of Burke. But religion was central to Cicero's idea of statesmanship, precisely in its immunity to rational and philosophic systematization. The aspirations of the most advanced civilizations, he seems to warn, cannot be realized through any human construction that excludes the transcendent reality and mystery of mankind's existence. The American intellectual Camille Paglia observed a few years ago that, quote, all the great world religions contain a complex system of beliefs regarding the nature of the universe and human life that is far more profound than anything that liberalism has produced. Perhaps then that commonwealth of Western nations shaped by the liberal aspirations of the Atlantic Charter could still benefit from the rallying cry of that slim oddity, Edmund Burke, Christian statesman.
Thank you very much, Professor Ian Crowe. Very inspiring. I love that Plutarchian notes, as in parallel lives between Cicero and Burke, and also that wonderful line of the rare breed of intelligent reforming conservatives. Also very provocative, I would say. Anyway, let's thank you again, Professor Ian Crowe. Excellent. Let me now introduce my dear colleague, Professor Ivone Moreira. She's my colleague at the Institute for Political Studies. She's a professor there, and she's also the renowned translator to Portuguese, of course, of Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Dr. Ivone Moreira, avance, por favor.
Thank you so much. I start by thanking Professor Spada and Professor Ian Crowe for being here. And thank you all of us, all of you, to be here also. My presentation is analyzing the Burke's presence, the Burke and the presence of providence in history. And analyzing that aspect, I'm trying to make a relation with this presence of providence and the Hegelian perspective of the spirit in history. So that is the main goal of this presentation. The idea that providence conducts history is constantly present in Burke's thought, from the texts of his youth to the texts he wrote towards the end of his life, criticizing the French Revolution. The guidance providence provides to man is directly related to the unveiling of principles in the course of history. The principles that guide human nature are discovered in civil life, in the transforming dialogue man has with time and culture. As to the origin of principles, Burke admits that they have a root that transcends individuals, even when socially considered, because they always transcend the lifetime of the generation in which those principles openly manifest themselves. If principles are discovered in the course of history by humans, who, when considered as such, always act wisely, with the help and kind intervention of providence, it cannot be said that those principles are rooted only in history, or culturally determined or confined to it. Burke himself denies the existence of a historical morality when he says, I quote, "History is a preceptor of prudence, not of principles." What this means is that principles are unveiled in history, but are to be discovered by a human reason that, although inserted in time and history, somehow participates in a wisdom that transcends time. When analyzing the basic principles of right and liberty, Burke says, I quote, "To observe the first principles of right springing up, involved in superstition and polluted with violence, until by length of time and favorable circumstances it has worked itself into clearness," end of quote. Pursuing a similar path, he says about the principles of liberty present in English society, I quote, "Thus was the nation kept continually fluctuating between freedom and servitude, but the principles of freedom were predominant, though the thing itself was not yet fully formed," end of quote. Each moral discovery is the result of a spiritual struggle for the revelation of principles, whose manifestation is the outcome of all the knowledge accumulated in society, guided by providence, where each new discovery is prepared for several generations by an entire civilization. I quote again, "It is pleasing to observe something of equity and distinction gradually insinuating itself into these unformed materials, and some transient flashes of light striking across the gloom which prepared for the full day that shone out afterwards," end of quote. The idea of the emergence of principles in history springing up from formless materials leads George Sabine to claim that Burke made an important contribution to the imposing romantic edifice which regarded reason in man as a manifestation of a cosmic spirit, gradually realizing itself in the history of nations, a conceptual building that would be finalized by Hegel. Russell Kirk also recognizes that Burke may have anticipated some ideas present in Romanticism, but has a different approach to it. Kirk's interpretation begins by underlining that Burke implicitly rejects Locke's concept of tabula rasa, saying instead that human mind participates in the accumulated experience of its ancestors, and the communion of culture between several generations guarantees a common ground not only through literature and deliberate instruction, but above all by costume, prejudice, and tradition. The Romantics followed Burke in this perception. Recent speculations in psychology about the collective intellect make us value Burke's reflections even more. In fact, according to Burke, the work of providence in history operates through man's actions and man's respect for cultural inheritance, as Burke himself implicitly admits. I quote, "I attest the retiring, I attest the advancing generations between which, as a link in the great chain of eternal order, we stand." End of quote. Burke's commitment to the contract between generations is linked with the idea that each generation and ultimately each person contributes and inherits from a larger cultural and spiritual world. The intergenerational contract denotes a continuity that unites various historical moments of a civilization that transcends each one of us, and for this collective spirit, each one of us is partly responsible. When Burke states that art is man's nature, in a certain sense, he is saying that all of us are responsible for the collective spiritual work of civilization. Another aspect of this same intuition can be found in the way Burke treats the relationship between the individual and the species, where he considers the individual foolish but the species wise. I quote, "For man is the most unwise and the most wise being. The individual is foolish. The multitude for the moment is foolish when they act without deliberation. But the species is wise, and when time is given to it as a species, it almost acts right." End of quote. Because individuals cannot overcome the wisdom of the species, purified throughout generations. I quote again, "As no water can rise higher than its spring." For Burke, the refinement and the wisdom of the species over time takes place through the method of reform, which, unlike innovation, advances by small steps. The next step is illuminated by what happened before and the path corrected. This is the only way to be culturally richer than, I quote, "the flies of a summer." We could almost represent this path of civilization as a walk in the fog. Each step unfolds a new reality that is conquered to broad daylight. The statement that the individual is foolish and the species wise could well be included in the perspective that sees him as anticipator of Hegel. The subordination of individual genius to the wisdom of the species finds some similarities in the position the German author has in Die Vernunft der Gesicht, according to which the individual spirit, however brilliant, will never surpass the spirit of the people who produced it. And when some convulsion happens in history, it is inscribed in the journey of the spirit in time. We can also find in Burke an anticipation of what Hegel, in the same book, calls the astuteness of reason, when Burke says that God can make men, when going after their private interest, serve the common good. I quote, "With thankfulness to the benign and wise disposer of all things, who obliges men, whether they will or not, in pursuing their own selfish interests to connect the general good with their own individual success." Hegel's astuteness of reason as disintegrating and ordering role of using the hero's self-serving impulses to express the spirit of his people in history. We must now address the question whether providence is, according to Burke, immanent or transcendent. Burke takes as a provision of providence that each singular man is inserted into a larger order to which he contributes by seeking to fulfill his own interests. The fact that Burke thinks that the political society is willed by God to allow humans to fully develop is in accordance with this idea that providence guarantees the compatibility of individual fulfillment and social fulfillment. Man is better fulfilled when he realizes his rationality, which develops itself better in society. In turn, The best realization of man's rationality is a contribution to the improvement of all society. Regarding providence intervention, Georges Sabine concludes from Burke's assertions that he defends the immanence of God in history. I quote Sabine. In this feeling for divine immanence in the social order and its historical development, Burke was strikingly like Hegel. Leo Strauss also states that Burke values prescription so much that he seems to dispense with transcendence to defend only evolution. Burke's thought in this regard is complex. There are several allusions to man's subordination to the transcendental providence, but one can also find elements that could justify the above interpretations. According to those interpretations, Burke referred to a certain divine infused in nature that should be revered only because it surpasses the limited human understanding. Burke assigns to the unveiling of principles and the cultural development of human nature in a historicity similar to that found in Hegel. It is necessary to recognize the presence of these elements and the existing similarities to justify the interpretations that see Burke as a prelude to the Hegelian view of history. His fascination with reading history in the light of a provident intervention leads Burleigh Taylor Wilkins to ask whether Burke is so involved and committed to this belief as to see God's presence as immanent in history at odds with Christian doctrine. The problem raised by Wilkins is real, and we cannot be completely sure that Burke did not sometimes see providence as intermingled with nature and history. However, references to providence identifying it with God and transcendence are explicit and abundant, and present not only in his public political thought, but also in other writings, as well as in his personal correspondence. The possible recognition of the transcendent character of providence present in history can be exemplified by the fact that, even recognizing its presence, one is not able to say which signs guide man in the recognition of this tutelage. It is admitted that the success of certain events, corroborating or contradicting measures prudently taken, may be a confirmation of the fulfillment of the will of providence, without man having any other criterion for recognizing it, since God's ways are mysterious. One could argue that the example does not resolve the problem of immanent versus transcendent providence, simply because the lack of knowledge about the ways of providence could be related to the scale and not to the nature of his manifestation. In another passage, Burke explicitly identifies the laws of nature with the laws of God. Again, this could be interpreted in two different senses. The classical sense, according to which nature, being created by God, is imago Dei, and its laws reflect the will of God towards nature, or in another sense, that of an immanence of God in nature. I think the later very unlikely, because it will not be in accordance with this genuinely pious mentality that Ian Crowe just mentioned just before. But the question still is open to further investigation that we cannot address here. However, the inspiring contribution of Burke to the approach Hegel and the Romantics have to this question is indubitable. Previously, I had addressed also the problem of human liberty in this context, but it's not possible to present it here. We are ending the time, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ivone Moreira. Very interesting. I was left wondering if the concept of providence in Burke inclines us towards a Christian scatology or to a liberal political economy. It's hard to decide. Anyway, let's leave that to the discussion. Right now, let me introduce our third speaker, Professor Jeffrey Nelson. And he is also an historian. and is the Senior Vice President in the educational program for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. He was the president of the Thomas More College of Liberal Arts, and he's the co-founder and vice chairman of the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. He's a great expert on the subject of conservative thought, and let me now, if he's listening, if his hearing is loud and clear, let me now give the floor to him. Professor Jeffrey Nelson, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
All right, my topic today is on historian Ross Hoffman, Edmund Burke, and the Atlantic community. It's a privilege to be with you and representing the Russell Kirk Center on what would have been the 103rd birthday of Russell Kirk. Echoing Yvonne's themes, it seems providential to deliver this paper today, focusing on Ross Hoffman, who was an early influence on Kirk, who was to become a dear friend. So I want to dedicate this humble talk to the memory of Russell Kirk and Ross Hoffman. His Harvard historian Bernard Bailyn, generally considered to be the father of the Atlantic History School of Historiography, has argued that the concept of Atlantic history proceeds from the belief that, quote, by the mid-18th century, Britain's involvement in the Atlantic world was so extensive at its apogee in the 1760s, the range of its interests in the territories it governed so broad, that its proper study is in effect a deep probe into the entire interhemispheric civilization. Significantly, this is the period that spans Edmund Burke's life and career. And in fact, while it is not usually emphasized, Atlantic historians draw more closely upon Edmund Burke than they perhaps have realized. In their own search for a tradition, central figures in the Atlantic school have pushed their lineage back to historians and public intellectuals who were themselves deeply, even principally, inspired by Edmund Burke. In this effort, the work of Bernard Bailyn, David Armitage is especially significant. Each has traced the origins of the School of Atlantic History to pre-Cold War Catholic historians attracted to the idea of a post-World War II Atlantic regional power center that might better protect the vestiges of Western or Latin Christendom against aggressively secular and nationalist regimes. Bailyn believed that thinkers such as these, especially sensitive to the threat of communist expansion, were the originators of this Atlantic idea. Bernard Bailyn in particular highlights the work of Fordham University historian Ross J.S. Hoffman, 1902 to 1979. He points to Hoffman's 1945 essay entitled Europe and the Atlantic Community as the first appeal by a professional historian to fashion a new idea of Atlantic history. In that essay, written on the curtain as the curtain of the Second World War was drawing closed, Hoffman observed, quote, our minds move in old grooves. We go on thinking in isolationist concepts of Europe and America, of Eastern and Western hemispheres, of old world and new world. Or we bridge these conceptual divisions in a universalism that takes little or no account of the realities which, after all, these concepts do designate in a rough and vague way. Thus, many fail even to notice the existence of the mighty geographic, historical, and political reality that surrounds us on all sides, the Atlantic community. For Hoffman, the states comprising the North and South American continents emerged from and were an extension of Western European Christendom. Burke's Commonwealth of Christian Europe was the specific historic and political reality Hoffman had in mind. Earlier than other Atlanticists, Hoffman, in an important 1942 work, one that Bailyn does not consider, characterized the Atlantic community as the inner sea of Christendom, the inner sea of Christendom. Throughout Hoffman's writings, the Americas are very much part of a geographic conception that Voltaire characterized in the 18th century as La Grande République d'Europe, and Hoffman recharacterized in the 20th century as the Great Republic. In this view, quote, Englishmen, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Portuguese, Dutchmen, and Danes in the early modern centuries made the Atlantic Ocean the inland sea of Western civilization. They made it an historical and geographical extension of the Mediterranean, around the shores of which our civilization began. Post-war American strategy, according to Hoffman, ought to be aimed at, quote, fortifying the American citadel, our historical roots, our natural allies, our political civilization, and our material fortunes are staked immovably in this citadel. This is the international community that expressed its deepest instincts and unwittingly described its own nature in the Atlantic Charter. Unquote. For Hoffman, the power and potential of the idea of Atlantic history resided in the recognition that as a community, the Atlantic nations were the progeny of Western Christendom. And in the current state of historical development, the children had matured and were now called upon to tend to their aging parent. Indeed, Hoffman and others who followed him believed it was the peculiar fate of the nations composing the North Atlantic Triangle to carry the burden of reinvigorating the body of Christendom in the 20th century, and in so doing, secure the current and future interests of free nations throughout the Western world. In a memoir of his academic career at Fordham, Hoffman alluded to this point, describing his own project in the 1930s and 40s as a, quote, protracted effort to use historical knowledge to advance right principles of politics, not Catholic principles, for there are no Catholic political principles, but principles consistent with the preservation and prospering of Christian values and ultimate ends. They had been well set forth by Leo XIII in his encyclical on Christian democracy. They were essentially Burke's principles of politics. Hoffman had begun as a socialist, but after World War I, converted to Catholicism and began to supplement his professional writing on European and American history with intellectual forays into the Middle Ages and ultimately to 18th century British history. Burke unlocked for Hoffman a usable past that connected morality and politics, Europe and America. This convergence of Burke and Atlantic history can be traced coincidentally to the very day that Franklin Roosevelt died, April 12, 1945, when Ross Hoffman founded what was in retrospect an influential Edmund Burke Society at Fordham University. Hoffman founded the Burke Society 1 month after publication of his essay on the Atlantic community's European legacy. The purpose of the society was to, quote, recall the principles, values, and traditions which are the heritage of the political and international society of Christendom. Hoffman later recounted the international as well as flavor of the society's gatherings, including distinguished guests such as Hugh Gibson, Herbert Hoover's great friend and the former ambassador to Belgium, Carlton Hayes, who we'll touch on in a minute, who was FDR's ambassador to Spain, the Catholic writer Frank Sheed, Walter Langsom, then president of the University of Cincinnati, Tibor Eckert, the former Hungarian prime minister, and so many others, including Evelyn Waugh. The members and guests of Fordham's Burke Society were interested in establishing new transatlantic intellectual connections, much like this conference, as much as they were in scholarly examinations of Burke's philosophical and political career. The results, however, were scholarly and political. 3 years after the Burke Society's founding, Hoffman and fellow Fordham historian Paul Levac released an influential new anthology of Burke's political writings in 1948. In their substantial introduction to that volume, Hoffman and Levac directly drew out the historical and contemporary connections between Burke's politics and Atlantic history. Quote, our history, they observed, seems to lengthen as we grow aware of the ancestral inheritance that we share with older nations across the Atlantic and of the heavy responsibilities that attach themselves to us. Burke's vision of America's place in this tradition is also made clear. Quote, in the age of the American Revolution, he had a fine vision of a great Atlantic world, which he desired to preserve in peace and union. Burke looked upon Europe and saw there a universal similitude of religion, laws, and manners. America, too, he said, was part of that moral and political order. Not surprisingly, Hoffman had applauded America's entry into World War II on the side of Britain for, quote, America's vast reservoir of material might and hidden stores of loyalty to the good cause, had rediscovered her mission and sounds her battle cry. What was the battle cry? Defense and preservation of the good cause, of the great republic, which Hoffman located, as I've noted, on what is now the intersea of intersea of Christendom. Hoffman's a great Atlantic republic was recognized to be a past and present reality, and thus seized upon and developed into a full theoretical basis for a new American foreign policy by Walter Lippmann, a prolific journalist who lived 1899 to 1974, and a public political thinker. Lippmann had coined the phrase Atlantic community in 1917. For Lippmann, North America had become the central region of the Atlantic world, and thus was largely responsible for its protection, which was in turn essentially the obligation of self-protection. His objective was not so much to make the world safe for democracy, as to make the Atlantic basin safe for freedom of the seas and American trade. Lippmann was a critic of isolationism, but he was not an ideological interventionist. His interventionism was restrained by his sense of the relations between America and Europe, which was historic and concrete, and not based on abstract universalist notions such as democracy or equality. Indeed, Lippmann reassessed his previous faith in democracy after World War II and became a critic of American liberalism. This philosophy of moderate interventionism, Lippmann shared with Hoffman. It is thus not surprising that during World War II, these two figures would invoke each other and Edmund Burke in their writings about the Atlantic community. For Lippmann, Hoffman had shown through his historical investigation that because the Atlantic, or what he called the oceanic community, is separated all through by water, quote, it cannot be held together by military compulsion. It cannot be one military empire ruled from one capital. It can be only a concert of free nations held together by a realization of their common interests and acting together by consent. Hoffman and Lippmann were not alone in viewing the Atlantic community of states as the progeny of Western civilization, that international community of which the Atlantic is the inland sea. Colombian historian Carlton J.H. Hayes, who lived 1882 to 1964, himself a prominent Catholic convert, a friend of Hoffman and Franklin Roosevelt's ambassador to Spain, put Frederick Turner's reigning frontier myth of American historiography into perspective in 1946, when he famously asked, quote, the American frontier of what? Hayes was writing to professional historians as president of their guild and challenging them to, quote, broaden their conception of the frontier and extend their researches and writings to a wider field. He attacked their polar view of American history, their exaggerated sense of American exceptionalism, in Balin's words. Specifically, he challenged historians to rethink the received understanding of the advancing frontier in North America and see it again as their earliest American forebears saw it, as a frontier of Europe. Quote, we used to know we were Europeans as well as Americans, he lamented. Hayes argued that Americans were, quote, modern Europeans living on the frontier of Europe. He characterized this insight as a historically broad vision and opposed it to the restricted interpretation of Frederick Turner and other historians. Such a shallow and circumscribed view of America's relationship to Europe was a principal cause, according to Hayes, of modern isolationism. But if Jacobinism was the great threat to the unity of this civilization in Burke's time, in Hayes, it was late 19th and 20th century nationalism, to what Hayes called the Jacobin nationalism of the French Republic and Napoleonic Empire. Britain countered with a traditional nationalism, articulated for it by Burke. For Burke, Hayes argued the state was a permanent union whose ends could not be accomplished in any one generation. The people, the nationality, were not distinct from their government, and they had no right to break the social tie which linked them to their forefathers. Hayes singled out three aspects of Burke's traditional nationalism for special emphasis and application. First, Burke stressed and glorified the aristocratic political nationalism of the British, and particularly the British Constitution, as the supreme embodiment of the genius of the English nation and its historical experience. Second, Burke stands as a pioneer in the exposition of the principle of nationality. Nationality for Burke didn't signify a geographical entity or aggregate of individuals. Nationality was a concrete expression of continuity, of extension of people in time as well as in space and numbers. Third, Burke's traditional nationalism was not quite so exclusive or paramount as the contemporary nationalism of the Jacobins. On the contrary, Burke advanced and pressed the idea of a hierarchy of loyalties, each supreme in its own sphere and all perfectly natural because all are traditional. For example, a man should be loyal to his family, his locality or region, to the national state, to the world and humanity, to God. Fundamentally, then, for Hayes, Western or European civilization was a proxy for Christendom, or in Hoffman's nomenclature, the Great Republic. While Burke died when it seemed that this great commonwealth was shattered, Hoffman acknowledged that in the 19th century, it was restored in part, and Burke's wisdom was a source for its restoration. But by the late 1940s for Hoffman and the many others who were influenced by him and by his ideas, including influential proteges such as John Lucas, Russell Kirk, Peter Stanlis, Francis Canavan, among many others, it seemed that, quote, a vastly greater calamity has overwhelmed our civilization, and no restoration has been accomplished. But the deepest instincts of our republic lead us to set our hand to the task. If we are to succeed, we shall have to find and follow leaders who possess something of Burke's quality. Today, changes in demographics and in political sensitivities have challenged the realization of Hoffman's view of the Atlantic community as a great republic, an international regional community of which the Atlantic is the inland sea. Atlantic history itself has been questioned more recently by the new school of so-called vast early America. Put forth by historians associated with the Omohundro Institute, the vast early American movement is the latest attempt to de-Westernize histories of America, and in so doing, discredit prior attempts to write American history as having been largely triumphalist. The charge then to scholars like us who remain interested in forging comparative transnational connections between America and the larger Atlantic world is to recommit, as Ross Hoffman encouraged, in fresh ways to, quote, study our Republican political society and the international community of Western Christendom in the same spirit, with the same passion for knowing reality that animated Burke's timeless efforts to obtain practical understanding of his world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey Nelson. I was quite moved by the image you used of the Atlantic Ocean as the inner sea of Christendom, as the sort of historical outgrowth of the ancient Mediterranean. And I kept reminding myself of this big row in 2004 over the Constitution for the European Union, which was eventually aborted. But we had a big row here around the question of the Christian roots of Europe. Anyway, let me introduce our last but not least speaker, Professor Michael Federici. I hope I didn't mispronounce your name, sir. Michael Federici is professor and chair of the Political Science and International Relations Department at the Middle Tennessee State University. He has published several books. One of them I should like to highlight, a book on Eric Voegelin, which is always a big challenge and a great landmark on anyone's resume. Professor Michael Federici, thank you again. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you for the invitation to present at the conference. My regrets for not being able to attend in person. The title of my presentation is Edmund Burke and the Challenge of Philosophic Analogy. Edmund Burke was not a philosopher who explained his political theory in systematic scholarly detail. He was a statesman who expressed intuitions about political life, sometimes preferring wisdom without reflection, imagination, and prejudice to rational calculation. When arguing about and commenting on the politics of his day, while immersed in the details of contemporary debates, Burke articulated philosophical insights that can seem, at first glance, to be contradictory and puzzling. Some of his most memorable insights are scattered in speeches and letters in a way that leaves one wanting deeper analysis. One such instance in Burke's reflections on the revolution in France is his reference to the spirit of philosophic analogy, made in the context of explaining change and continuity. Burke invokes the concept, but never defines or explains it. The objective of this paper is to explain the meaning of that phrase and its place in his larger political theory. In doing so, I will draw on the writings of Irving Babbitt, who is especially attentive to Burke's attempts to avoid zero-sum and monistic thinking and to synthesize universality and particularity, continuity, and change. Burke's reference to the spirit of philosophic analogy comes at the beginning of Reflections as part of a passage about the British political tradition and the efforts of statesmen to maintain continuity with it while attending to the circumstances of the day and the need for reform. As he does throughout the book, Burke draws a contrast between the British habit of maintaining tradition and the tendency in revolutionary France to disregard it. He does more than defend the British tradition against the rise of Jacobin ideology. he articulates a philosophy of tradition that differentiates it from antiquarianism, following tradition for its own sake, and Jacobinism, the rejection of tradition in favor of ahistorical abstraction. Burke's political theory is shaped by dialectical synthesis, the reconciliation of seemingly opposite forces in political life. Among such opposites that exist in tension are continuity and change, natural and artificial, historical concreteness, and metaphysical abstraction. It is important to note that for Burke, society is organic. While it changes over time, it remains fundamentally the same. Preservation requires change. Society's ability to survive and thrive depends on the dexterity of its leaders to adapt to the times without destroying its engendering character, identity, and purpose. Revolutionary societies are of a different pedigree. They have little, if any, interest in preservation of tradition. In fact, they are in revolt against it. Burke makes several points and reflections that lead to his use of the concept, the spirit of philosophic analogy. In referring to the Glorious Revolution, he states that, quote, "We wished at the period of the Revolution, and do now wish, to derive all we possess as an inheritance from our forefathers." Yet he qualifies this statement by adding, "Upon that body and stock of inheritance, we have taken care not to inoculate any scion alien to the nature of the original plant." In other words, care is taken to allow for new growth that may gradually change the original plant as long as it naturally stems from it, which is not to say that all such scions are good for the plant's welfare. Judgments will have to be made about the prudence of pruning, inoculating, or benevolently neglecting the plant. Experience and prejudice will shape judgment, as will what Burke calls political reason, a computing principle, adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, morally and not metaphysically or mathematically, true moral denominations. Prudence is necessary in politics because of the complexity of human nature that Burke describes as intricate. He adds that the objects of society are of the greatest possible complexity, and therefore no simple disposition or direction of power can be suitable either to man's nature or to the quality of his affairs. In this instance and others, Burke is engaging in philosophic analogy. Change and preservation are similar in regard to plants and constitutions. British liberty emanates from an entailed inheritance that was maintained by ancestors and will be passed on to the rising generations. He explains this point in greater detail in his famous passage about society as a partnership between the dead, living, and yet to be born. British liberty is historically derived without any reference whatever to any other more general or prior right. Burke distinguishes between the rights of men and the rights of Englishmen. The implication is that British rights and liberties are not derived from ahistorical, abstract rights, like those advocated by the French revolutionaries or social contract theorists. So-called natural rights are, to Burke's thinking, a priori, detached from the circumstances of culture and place that gave them their identity, substance, and purpose. They stem from metaphysical abstractions that lack the fullness of historical existence. Historically grounded rights and liberties preserve a unity in so great a diversity of its parts. Although the community of British subjects is historically and culturally diverse, the Constitution that embodies their rights and liberties preserves unity within this diversity. The institutions of the political system form a permanent body composed of transitory parts. As he often does, Burke synthesizes two seemingly opposite things: permanence and change. He explains that the whole at one time is never old or middle-aged or young, but in a condition of unchangeable constancy. It moves on through the varied tenor of perpetual decay, fall, renovation, and progression. He adds that by preserving the method of nature in the conduct of the state, in what we improve, we are never wholly new. In what we retain, we are never wholly obsolete. By adhering in this manner and on those principles to our forefathers, we are guided not by the superstition of antiquarians, but by the spirit of philosophic analogy. There is much to unpack in this dense passage. Burke claims that the British approach to tradition follows nature. In the conduct of political life, the British preserve the method of nature by passing through the generations their artificial institutions. As he does with permanence and change, Burke synthesizes natural and artificial. What is natural about the British Constitution? Like things in nature, it is organic, incapable of remaining exactly the same as time passes. The forces of decay and renovation are inescapable. Parts of the Constitution will become obsolete in time as circumstances change. Yet decay does not mean death. Like the maintenance of an orchard, the right cultivation can ensure future health and growth of its trees. All trees will have to be pruned, some transplanted, some will die. The orchard is essentially the same after pruning, transplanting, and death, but it is not identical to what it has been. It is both old and new. Burke contrasts the happy effect of following nature with a spirit of innovation. Moderate reform tied to an inherited tradition rests on the assumption that the current generation is dependent on past generations for the wisdom of experience. It is modest and humble in assessing what the current generation can do to improve the quality of life. By contrast, innovators divorce themselves from the wisdom of experience in favor of the wisdom of the age. They are filled with hubris and a contempt for previous generations. Old ways of life are not viewed as something to be pruned, but uprooted en masse because they are the source of contemporary injustices. The scope of reform becomes revolutionary when the objective is not pruning the orchard, but burning it to the ground and starting anew. The current generation, in this view, always knows better than previous generations. What is the significance of Burke's dialectical synthesis and his use of philosophical analogy? What does it indicate about his view of universality and reason? His political theory generally, and his view of universality in particular, have been subject to repeated misinterpretation. Commentators on Burke often classify him as an historical relativist who fails to embrace universality. What seems to be so perplexing about Burke's political theory is its insistence on avoiding zero-sum thinking. If he speaks disparagingly of reason or rationality, he must then reject them in all their forms. If he appeals to moral sentiment, he is resting his case on only the ground of emotion. Yet the very texture of Burke's political theory involves synthesis and moderation. He tends to reject extreme revolutionary arguments and actions in favor of continuity. Yet continuity requires change and reform. By rejecting a specific revolutionary change, he is not rejecting all forms of change. By rejecting metaphysical abstraction, he is not rejecting all forms of reason. In his defense of just prejudice, Burke opposes naked reason, but suggests that prejudice has a reason of its own. He is not engaging in zero-sum thinking as if the choice is between reason on one hand or prejudice and sentiment on the other. Burke recognizes that reason and prejudice take different forms and vary to the extent that they convey wisdom or folly. He appeals to the best of each faculty while expressing the notion that imagination and established ways of life are superior to the naked reason of sophisters, economists, and calculators. Moral imagination and just prejudice are not naked. They are imbued in the context of the reflections with the entailed inheritance of Britain. Why does Burke place emphasis on circumstances while opposing abstract right? Some would argue that circumstances are part of the flux and rights exist above it. Rights are universal and permanent. Burke, however, insists that universality can only be found in particular historical circumstances. There is no universal known to humans that exists only outside of history. To find universality, individuals must navigate the circumstances of historical life. Consequently, rights, like liberty, require circumstances to provide context, to provide limits and boundaries to what is prudent. In conclusion, the truth of reality can be conveyed in different forms, including myth, allegory, fiction, and philosophic analogy. While humans cannot know reality perfectly, they can understand it to varying degrees. Moreover, insight is gained by a right use of illusion or imagination. In his introduction to Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, Neil Gaiman remarks that fiction is a lie that tells us true things over and over. It transmits ideas and experiences through generations. It allows us to emphasize with human beings who face both similar and different circumstances of their own. Fiction broadens our experiential horizon in a way that provides a better sense of what it means to be human that can be grasped from one's limited individual experience alone. Fiction compels its readers to use their imaginations to consider the plight of its characters, and in doing so to consider possibilities that may not have occurred to the reader. While Burke does not use fiction to convey the truth of reality, he does use philosophic analogy, an appeal to imagination that recognizes the limitations of rational philosophizing and the power of common experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Federici. I hope you don't mind, but as you were reflecting on this big question of change and continuity, I was assimilating your talk as a lesson, not exactly about Burke, but to all present-day conservatives, or at least to all moderate politics in the Western world. It's a big, big challenge. Thank you again. Now, let me invite you, Professor Yvonne Moreira, and you gentlemen online, to open the debate and get some questions from the audience. Let us take some questions now. Alguém quer colocar perguntas? Gentleman in the back, please.
Well, thank you, everyone, for this very enlightening talk.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, sure. I'm John Nerona. My wife and I are professors from Rome. We're American, but have been in Rome. And we are delighted to be a part of this. And thank you so much for this enlightened presentation on so many aspects of Burke. And considering so many little aspects of what you shared with us, of this transitional period in the 18th century from Burke, who, as you demonstrated, rooted in reason, in a sense of balanced judgment, also grounded in nature and metaphysics, almost being, actually was prophetic, especially the French Revolution, the East India Company, and also with the American independence struggle. And then his influence on Hoffman and Russell Kirk. So with this idea of his grounding in especially at the end, speaking about the universals grounded in experience particulars, how is this relevant to us during this transitional phase?
Thank you. Let's take another question before I ask our speakers to respond. Professor Owen, please. You don't need to introduce yourself.
Clifford Orwin from the University of Toronto. I found all of the talks very enlightening. My appreciation to all of the speakers. I did feel, though, that in a way the theme of the session got lost in the shuffle. So I wondered whether any of you would be willing to state whether, in fact, there is a clear conception of Christendom in Burke, and if so, what that conception is. Thank you.
Great question. Now, shall ask you to respond. Who wants to start? Ladies first, perhaps. Right, gentlemen? Ladies first. Professor Yvonne Moreira.
Thank you so much for the questions. About the question that Professor, the first question, I think that perhaps Professor Federici addressed the subject much closer to your question than myself. So I leave the question to Professor Federici, which I think it's better adequate to his presentation. Relatively to the question Professor Orwin puts, it's a very interesting question, and Burke himself he likes to be connected to the Christianity at large. He mentions that expression in the in his notebook. He starts by mentioning it in his notebook, but he mentions it several times. About Christianity, I'm connected to Christianity at large. I'm connected to Christianity fundamentally. I think that religion, all the forms of Christianity add in themselves. It is Burke says that is in themselves good forms of religion and connection and the connection with Christianity, and fundamentally true. And the external form of these particular devotions are not essential. So the form of Christianity, the Christianity in itself, is connected to, but not. And he states that he is connected to the Protestant religion, but he also likes to underline that the fundamental connection with Christianity and for Christians should be the connection with the salvation through Christ, but not with the particular form that religion acquires culturally. So the connection with Christendom is a broad one, I think.
Thank you. Now, gentlemen, who wants to go first? Okay, Professor Michael Federici. The last shall be the first shall be the last, like the gospel says.
Thank you. I'd like to respond to the question that John asked regarding the relevance of Burke's emphasis on experience to contemporary politics. And let me simply add to the question that in his emphasis on experience, Burke is suggesting that we find universality in particularity. So how does something like that help a contemporary statesman? And I'll give you an example from my own country, the United States, its conduct of foreign policy. Form is not the thing that matters for Burke, at least not form in and of itself. And there are too many politicians in my own country and in Europe who believe the form of democracy is what matters and that it ought to be exported around the globe in some form of sort of Fukuyama-esque, this is the one great form of government that guarantees rights and liberties, and therefore to make life better in all places in the globe, they ought to be democratized. I think Burke would find such a policy abhorrent for the very reason that what matters to Burke are the circumstances of place, the circumstances of a particular country and a particular culture. And what works in one place may not work in another place, that there is an overarching objective to provide good government and that government should create laws that lead people to justice. But the idea that there's only one form in which government should take really is anathema to someone like Burke, who is suggesting that we need to find in the different particular circumstances of a culture what the right path is. And that path is not going to be the same in every country. So US efforts to create viable democracies in places like Iraq and Afghanistan were doomed from the very beginning to end in failure because they did not recognize what I think is one of the great insights of Burke, and that is that circumstances matter. If you don't have the cultural prerequisites for something like democracy, and those two countries surely do not, you are not going to impose by the point of the gun or by throwing billions of dollars into a country, a form of government that can't possibly work in those circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Professor Jeffrey Nelson or Professor Ian Crowe, who wants to go? Perhaps you, Professor Ian Crowe, you've been waiting for such a long time now.
Yeah,
Sure. Well, I would just want to make a few comments about the concept of Christendom. But while I was listening to the other papers, it occurred to me that perhaps the only essential topic we should teach at our schools is gardening or horticulture, because so much depends, doesn't it, on the ability of humans to see almost physically, whether that be by analogy or sheer hard work or, the way in which values and virtues are sort of imitated, translated through the period. And the reason I mention that is because, in a sense, I think Christendom means to Burke the effective working of culture, religion being essential to the working of culture, the effective working of culture in a particular period, in particular geographical circumstances, as Dr. Federici has suggested. And again, I mean, that's very similar, I think, to the way in which Cicero's mind worked. One of the things I would have done in my paper, of course, is to have tried to bring in some more examples of Cicero thinking about religion and the role of religion. And, one of the points that he makes, I believe, in the offices, Identifies, is, that wisdom is essentially knowledge of the bond between God and man and between man and man. And Christendom, I suppose, the closer I could get, I mean, definitions, precise definitions are not going to be particularly attractive to Burke, but you know, the closest one can get is that in a sense, Christianity, I would say particularly with its concept of the Trinity, which I do believe Burke placed sort of above and in a special place when it came to sort of beliefs, Christendom, that this is the feature beyond philosophical explanation or you know, or rational explanation that enables culture, as it were, to develop and therefore for virtue to be promoted and handed on through society in the most effective and efficient way. So in a sense, it's a definition of Christendom through function rather than through creed.
Thank you. Professor Jeffrey Nelson.
Well, briefly, to John's point about Burke, today's relevance. I mean, we don't live in a very Burkean time in terms of the temperance of the populace these days. We live in an intemperate time where it's sort of, you know, it's us versus them, at least in political circles, within conservative circles. It's and so thinkers like Burke, whose thinking is fundamentally prudential, the politics of prudence is not in fashion, and yet they're always these are foundational, important concepts to recover a strong understanding of prudence, of moderation, to be a moderate, to appeal to the classical themes of moderation and prudence. And even in conservative circles, where you think that they would be less controversial, are seen as nowadays, in many ways, very weak, squishy, as the phrase is amongst them. And there's just not a lot of patience because there's such a fervor and such a concern for the state of the present political order on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think recovering Burke and finding a way to understand that these concepts of prudence and on moderation are important, and they're far from being milquetoast. And the traditional concepts there can be very strong, very tough. But the circumstances, as Michael said, color everything. Whether you moderate and you reform, or whether you have to go all in sometimes. And nowadays, I think the prudential character that really was more dominant in the previous generation of conservatism is viewed more impatiently by the younger generation. And I think that's doesn't portend good things. And you can already see even so-called conservatives now in America in particular being very happy with the idea of jettisoning constitutional arrangements and being post-liberal and moving other directions. And this is just losing sight of the very foundational importance of Burke. And to the degree that we can recover this politics of prudence, I think we'll be doing our cultures, our peoples, a lot of good. I mean, we're about cultural renewal, and the previous generation of conservatives, from Burke to the last generation of conservatism, we're concerned with the renewal of our order, renewal of our civilization, this whole concept of Christendom. And as I quoted Hoffman talking about this idea of Christendom as being a universal similitude of religion, laws, and manners between Europe and America, that we both share that universal similitude and that shared patrimony. And so drawing on what binds us together and our common inheritance, and that idea of Christendom, whatever that's going to look like as you reform and move forward, I think Burke is evergreen, and maybe to tap into the organic themes of Ian and Michael. He's evergreen, and the deep roots of our civilization need watering, need attention, and so, more Burke the better in our age.
Okay, great advice, I think. Let me now thank you again to you, Professor Ivan Moret, of course, and you gentlemen online. It was a great panel, 4 wonderful papers. Thank you again, and thank you I thank the audience also. And let's wrap it up and go have dinner. Thank you.